On the morning of June 5, 1976, Darrell Grigg and his friend David Benson stepped onto a small island in the Teton River and cast their fishing lines. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, the volcanic rock streaked with sage, and the river running cold and fast with snowmelt. A small airplane came in low over the canyon, buzzing them as the pilot waved. The men waved back as they noticed the river rising over the island. Somewhere upstream, a 30-foot wall of water was coming down the canyon toward them. The Teton Dam was a 300-foot-tall earthfill dam built across the mouth of that canyon in eastern Idaho. A structure that took 3 years to design and 2 years to build, it was filling with snowmelt for the first time when something inside it began to move. The dam was built on a promise to provide consistent irrigation water to the farming communities in the Snake River Plain below the dam. In the summer of 1976, those communities received more water than the dam had ever been designed to deliver. The Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that built dams across the American West, had been eyeing the Teton River Basin for decades. The logic was simple. Every spring, snowmelt surged off the Teton Range and down through the canyon onto the Snake River Plain. Farmers on the plain needed that water in July and August when the river ran low. A dam at the canyon mouth would catch the spring flood and hold it for summer irrigation. Congress authorized the Teton Basin Project in 1964, and construction began in 1972. The Bureau knew the site had a significant challenge that needed to be addressed. The right canyon wall was made of volcanic rock riddled with fractures. Bureau geologists surveyed the rock before construction and documented a network of open joints running through it. The question for the engineers was how to keep a reservoir's worth of pressure from forcing water into that fractured rock and around the dam entirely. There was a two-part solution: address the fractures in the wall, and then seal the dam structure itself to the bottom and side walls of the canyon to make a watertight seal. Performing a technique called grouting, workers pumped cement into the fractured rock wall to seal the joints. The design also called for a clay-rich core running through the center of the dam, keyed into the bedrock by a deep trench cut along the canyon floor and up both walls. By filling the trench with clay, it locked the dam to the canyon, becoming the seal. Surprisingly, the gaps in the rock swallowed far more grouting material than anyone had estimated. Cement poured into the right abutment and kept going. The crew sealed joints up to roughly elevation 5,200 on the right side wall and then stopped. The joints above that line were left open. The key trench was filled with a fine-grained silt called loess. Better graded material, the kind of granular fill that resists erosion, was available from a site downstream, but the Bureau passed on it, partly for environmental reasons. There was one more defense the design left out. Where the silt trench met the fractured bedrock, the surface between the two was exactly the kind of location water would attack first, and the standard protection against that was a filter zone. A filter zone is a band of carefully sorted gravel that lets water pass by but traps soil particles before they can be carried away. Well-designed earthfill dams use them as a last line of defense. The Teton Dam was not engineered with any filter zones at the key trench. A geologist named David Schleicher, working for the United States Geological Survey, wrote an internal memo. Schleicher had studied the Teton site and warned that a failure during filling would make the local flood of February 1962 look like small potatoes. He recommended placing cameras at vantage points to monitor the first fill. The memo entered a review process. Over 6 months of redrafting, the language was softened as the Bureau called the original version alarmist. Schleicher's recommendations were not incorporated into the plan. The reservoir began filling in October 1975. Water rose at about a foot per day. The following March, the rate was authorized to increase to 2 feet per day. The low-level outlet works, the pipes that would allow operators to release water from the bottom of the reservoir, were not yet operational. The spillway gates were still being painted, which left no way to release water from the dam quickly if necessary. By the first week of June 1976, the reservoir sat just 3 feet below the spillway sill. Inspectors walking the downstream side of the right abutment found 2 small seeps more than 1,000 feet from the dam's toe. The water was running clear. Clear seepage for a first filling is not unusual for an earth-fill dam. Water finds paths through any structure that large. Combined, the flow coming from the seeps was about 100 gallons per minute. The engineers noted the flow and increased inspection frequency. The next evening, a third seep appeared, this one closer to the toe of the dam and flowing at about 20 gallons per minute. This seep was also running clear. Inspectors walked the area again after dark and found nothing new. The seeps were holding steady with the water still being clear. Early Saturday morning, a wet spot appeared on the downstream face of the dam itself. Within 2.5 hours, that wet spot had become a torrent, discharging 20 to 30 cubic feet per second. The water was brown and full of sediment. The dam was no longer seeping, it was eroding from the inside. The Bureau contacted the Fremont and Madison County Sheriff's offices. Evacuation calls went out, but the dam was still standing, and yet no one knew how much time they had. With a skeleton crew working the site over the weekend, a final call was made to the general excavation foreman at home, and he quickly drove to the dam. 2 D9 Caterpillar bulldozers, the largest machines on site, moved onto the downstream face. One of the operators was Jay Calderwood, who had helped build the dam and knew the slopes by feel. The D9 operators shoved fill material and up to 3-foot boulders into the growing breach, but nothing slowed it. The water cut through everything they pushed in. After roughly 20 minutes, the ground beneath the second bulldozer gave way. The operator jumped off the dozer and ran up the hill, grabbed a different dozer to attempt to save the stuck D9, but failed, and it was swept away. Both operators continued filling the hole from the safer side of the breach. Not long after, at 11:52 a.m., they abandoned the effort. 3 minutes later, the right abutment failed. The breach expanded from a gap the size of a swimming pool to a surge of water 75 feet deep in minutes. Don Ellis, who owned the radio station KRXK in Rexburg, had driven his daughter to the dam overlook to see what was happening. He had a 2-way radio in his vehicle and began broadcasting live. "The whole north side of the Teton Dam is caving in," he said, "and water is coming through in monumental amounts. It's coming apart. It's just completely coming apart." His broadcast reached Rexburg before any official warning did. Down in the canyon, Grigg and Benson had no radio and no warning beyond the airplane pilot they had waved to. By the time the water reached them, the canyon was filling wall to wall. Grigg told Benson to jump in the river. Both men jumped, and Grigg was able to find a log to hold on to. That was the last time he saw David Benson. The current carried Grigg 3 miles. Somewhere in that distance, the log collided with something in the torrent, and the impact broke 5 of his ribs and punctured a lung. He floated until he reached a cottonwood tree standing in the flood and climbed 20 feet above the waterline. He hung there, alone, injured, watching the canyon fill with timber and debris and muddy water. "First, I started cussing," he said later. "Then I decided that wasn't doing any good, so I started praying." When asked if the praying helped, Grigg said, "I don't know if it helped or not, but I know it didn't hurt." Grigg clung to the tree for roughly 4 hours. Around 5 that afternoon, a man named Craig Hawes reached him in a boat and Grigg was airlifted out by helicopter. Downstream, the flood hit in sequence. Wilford, the small community closest to the canyon mouth, took a 15-foot wall of water with almost no warning. Over 100 of its 154 homes were destroyed. Sugar City was under 15 feet of water within 2 hours. Governor Cecil Andrus flew over later and said, "Part of Sugar City is there and part of it is just gone." Rexburg, the largest town in the path, had roughly an hour of warning. Sheriff's deputies drove through neighborhoods. Local radio repeated the evacuation. Phone networks lit up. Most residents made it to Ricks College, which sat on higher ground above the flood line. The lower sections of town still flooded 6 to 8 feet deep. Rexburg's mayor had initially dismissed the early reports. "We had lived in the shadows of dams for years in Idaho," he said. "It did not seem possible." By 8 that evening, the reservoir was empty. 11 people were dead, thousands of head of livestock had drowned, and 25,000 people had no home to return to. David Benson's body was recovered a quarter-mile from the cottonwood tree where Grigg had found safety. An independent panel of 3 engineers was convened to determine the cause of the dam's failure. The engineers examined the wreckage and the design records before delivering their findings in December 1976. The mechanism they identified was called piping. Reservoir water, under pressure, had forced its way through the unsealed joints in the fractured right abutment wall and into the key trench. Once inside the trench, the water began moving through the fine-grained loess fill, carrying out the silt particles with it. Each particle removed made the path a little wider, which allowed more water through, which carried more particles. The cycle fed itself. By the time brown water appeared on the downstream face, the interior of the dam had been hollowing out for hours. The panel's conclusion was blunt. The design did not adequately consider the foundation conditions and the characteristics of the soil. Defensive measures, specifically filter zones at the key trench, were well within the state-of-the-art. They should have been used but were not. The fractured rock was documented. The silt was known to be erodible. The grouting program had revealed how hungry the joints were for material. The tools to prevent this existed and were standard practice, but were not applied. The Bureau of Reclamation conducted its own investigation and reached a different emphasis. Bureau investigators argued that the geological conditions were less foreseeable than the independent panel concluded, placing primary responsibility on the nature of the site rather than on the design choices. Neither report named any individual. No criminal charges were filed. Federal claims reached $322 million, dispersed over 11 years. The claims process required documentation that many farming families in eastern Idaho had never kept. Generations of investment in soil, livestock, and equipment had been built up rather than purchased in traceable transactions. Many claimants considered the settlements they received inadequate. The National Dam Safety Act, signed into law in 1972, had sat unfunded for nearly 5 years. The Teton failure, followed 17 months later by the Kelly Barnes Dam collapse in Georgia that killed 39 people, finally drove Congress to fund a national dam safety inspection program. The Bureau of Reclamation established a dam safety division. Filter zones adjacent to key trenches became mandatory. The Teton Basin project was ultimately abandoned, and the dam was never rebuilt. The Teton River runs through the canyon today, past the abutment remains. Grigg gave his account to the Teton Oral History Program on July 10, 1977. He talked about the island, the plain, the dam and the flood, the tree and the rescue. In the hours that came before all of it, he said, "It was pretty good fishing." When asked where he stood on the dam now, Grigg said, "I was for it, but I'm opposed to it now." That's the report on the Teton Dam collapse. Thanks for watching Cold Wreckage.